Good afternoon and good morning to those west of us in Thunder Bay, where I am. My name is Steve Mantis, and I sit on the steering committee of Disability and Work Canada. Welcome to our panel discussion today on the COVID-19 impacts on persons with disabilities, what the statistics and the other qualitative research tell us. We're going to have a number of presentations to begin the session, and then we will follow up with a Q&A, a question and answer session. We should have about 15 minutes for that piece. If you have questions, please click on the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. The chat could also work, so either way, potentially we could take some live questions. I'm not sure technically if we're able to do that, but if you have trouble with the typing function, definitely put your hand up and we'll see if we can accommodate that for questions as well. Following this session, we'll go directly into a networking session that will go for another 20 minutes. Where you can either continue the discussion we've been having, or you can always go to another of the 4 sessions. These will be our networking sessions, which are new this year in terms of trying to increase the participation of participants in the conference. So it's my pleasure to introduce our 5 panelists today. Their bios are available on the conference program on the conference website. So I won't use up their valuable time giving a lot of information on them, but they bring a wealth of experience and research knowledge to us in our discussion today. First up is Carly McDermott. She's a lead analyst with the Disability and Accessibility, the Diversity and Social Culture Statistics at Statistics Canada, which is part of Government Canada. Following that, Deborah Steinstra will be presenting. She is the Jaroslawski Chair in Families and Work. She's the director of Live Work Well Research Center, and she's a professor at the University of Guelph. Following that, we'll have 2 presenters from CCRW, the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work. Marnie Lifson is a researcher, and Christiane Mann is a knowledge transition specialist, and they'll be talking a little bit about some of the research they have been doing. And Gregor Sharp will be our final panelist. He is a senior research associate at the Angus Reid Institute, and they had a partnership with the Rick Hansen Foundation, and he'll be sharing some of that information as well. So we'll go right away to Carly, and can't wait to hear what all of you have to say, and then we'll come back to the question and answer. Carly, over to you.
Thanks so much, Steve. So good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be a part of the Disability and Work in Canada conference this year. So as mentioned, my name is Carly McDermott, and I am an analyst working within the Disability and Accessibility program at Statistics Canada. I also have my lovely colleague Susan with me to help me navigate through the slides. So we'll start by getting our screen share going. So I will start with some information on the Disability and Accessibility program here at StatCan. So we provide data related to disability and accessibility, primarily through the Canadian Survey on Disability, or CSD, and other surveys such as the Survey on Accessibility in Federal Sector Organizations, or SAFSO. As many may know, the government loves a good acronym, so there'll be a few in this presentation. We are also actively looking for alternative data sources such as open data or administrative data. And in addition to this, we also undertake the analysis of disability and accessibility data, which results in the publication of various data products, including infographics, fact sheets, data tables, and research articles. And we also have some sign language videos available for selected releases. And all of the data products are included on our Accessibility Data Hub. So next, I'll do a brief history lesson on the evolution and development of disability data at StatCan. So we do collect data on both the medical and social model of disability through various surveys. Within our area, the Disability and Accessibility Program, we focus on the social model, although this has been a little bit of an evolution over time. Just for those who may not be familiar, I'll give a little definition of each model to differentiate between the two. Within the social model, disability is the result of the interaction between a person's functional limitations and barriers in the environment, including social and physical barriers that make it harder to function day to day. In contrast, within the medical model, a disability is the result of functional limitations faced by an individual, and these limitations are the reason they cannot fully participate in society. So in terms of the timeline, I'll start in 2001 and 2006 with our Participation and Activity Limitation Survey, or PALS for short. And this survey included a functional model of disability looking at limitations in activities of daily living. Then in 2010, Canada ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and a new disability data strategy was launched as a result. So this led to the development of the disability screening questions, or the DSQ, which moved towards the social model across all disability types. The DSQ was then included in the 2012 version of the Canadian Survey on Disability. Moving to 2017, the CSD made use of a more inclusive set of filter questions on the 2016 census, improving coverage of disability types, especially the less visible disability types. And next up will be the 2022 iteration of the survey. And this will include a new accessibility module that helps to better understand the accessibility challenges that persons with disabilities may face. Otherwise, engagement with stakeholders found that data users really wanted consistency between the 2017 and 2022 cycles. So that led to minimal changes to the survey, including within the DSQ itself. So next up, I will just briefly go over the CSD in a little bit more detail. It's a national survey of Canadians aged 15 years and older. It's conducted on a 5-year cycle since it uses the census long form questionnaire for sampling. And it includes persons only living in private households. Persons living in First Nations reserves are covered by a separate survey conducted by the First Nations Information Governance Center, or FNIGC. So it does provide the national disability rate, as well as comparative data for persons with and without disability. And the data file includes over 2,400 variables on persons with disabilities, with also a linkage to 300 census variables. So it's a pretty rich data source on the topic. Moving on to the Accessible Canada Act, or the ACA, which came into force in 2019, and it aims to create a barrier-free Canada by 2040 for all people, particularly those with disabilities. And it includes 7 priority areas, as well as the overall goal of culture change. So the Act speaks to the overarching need to raise awareness and change behaviors and break down attitudinal barriers faced by persons with disabilities in order to promote greater social inclusion. It also enshrines the principle of nothing without us, and this requires the Government of Canada to engage the disability community in every aspect of implementation and advancing accessibility more broadly. So in collaboration with Employment and Social Development Canada, StatsCan is looking to develop accessibility related data to support the identification and removal of barriers. And the ACA does cover different sectors within Canada. So this includes the federally regulated private sector, the federal government, Canadian Forces, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, as well as Parliament. So next up, we will go over some of the available accessibility data at StatCan. So there is some content related to accessibility on the current iteration of the Canadian Survey on Disability. In addition, we recently undertook a rapid stats project to develop a quick survey called the Survey on Accessibility in Federally Regulated Organizations. And then there also is some further information on the Indigenous Peoples Survey and Canada's Core Public Infrastructure Survey. So in order to continue to address the need for data, we are developing survey content for potential data collection opportunities, and we are investigating available administrative data from our federal partners. And then as mentioned previously, the 2022 CSD will have a module devoted to accessibility as well. So that's end of me throwing a lot of information at you. And now we'll do a little bit of a tour of our Accessibility Data Hub. So we'll start at the Statistics Canada homepage, and you go to subjects up on the left-hand corner. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll find a link to our Accessibility Data Hub. So it was launched, the hub was launched earlier this year as a way to present information on accessibility. So given that it's a relatively new statistical program at StatCan, the majority of our data is focused on the accessibility experiences of persons with disabilities. However, we do recognize that accessibility is a broader concept and is applicable to everyone regardless of disability status. I would like to mention too that the hub did undergo accessibility testing to ensure that it's compliant with all applicable standards. And we are working with external stakeholders to ensure that we are exceeding the standards wherever possible. So now a little bit more specifics on the hub. It is divided into tiles or sections that contain different types of information. And generally across most of the Statistics Canada hubs, you'll see the same types of tiles, just in varying layouts. So in the top right corner, you'll see our social media tile. So this contains links to all of our social media accounts, such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And then on the left-hand side, you'll see the Find Data On section, and it is organized by ACA priority area. I'll let Susan get back there. There we go. And this, we have one for built environment communication, design and delivery of programs and services, employment, information communication, technology, and transportation. You will note that we do not have an icon for procurement as of right now, just because we don't have any data currently available. So as an example, if you select one of the topics like communication, you'll be directed to a subsequent search page. In order to find products related to accessibility and disability, the search results have been pre-filtered by disability, and then with a subsequent filter for communication. So these filters can be changed to suit the needs of the data user. And then within each icon, you can access data, analytical products, and reference material that is related to the topic. So if we go back to the main page, we also have a features tile in the center there. So it contains a carousel of the most recent Statistics Canada releases on topics of accessibility and disability. So this will rotate and change as we release more. And next to it on the right, we have a key indicators tile, which presents data points which support the measurement of accessibility under the ACA. So if you click on a key indicator, you are then taken to the data table where it comes from, which has much more information and more details as well. And if we go back to the main page again, and we're scroll down a little bit, we have a section that provides links to all the accessibility and disability related infographics we have created. And then moving over to the right, we have an analysis section that shows all of our disability and accessibility related analysis. To the left of that, we have a link to the 2017 data visualization tool we created. It uses Power BI to present disability rates by age and sex for the provinces and the territories. And then finally, towards the bottom, we do have a section on external data sources and the legislation and regulations. So that has a direct link to the Accessible Canada Act, as well as some provincial regulations as well. And at the very bottom, we have links to related hubs. So Statistics Canada has developed a variety of hubs to centralize data on similar topics. So you can link to them really quickly through our hub as well. So that's it for the walkthrough. But while I have you on the hub, we're going to quickly highlight some findings from our two recent releases. So I'll focus on the infographics as they're a little bit more visually appealing, and they have a small set of data points, which are a little bit easier to digest. So starting with our last year's release, we conducted a crowdsourced survey to collect information on the impacts of the pandemic on persons with disabilities. So this information was collected from June 23rd to July 2020. So the responses reflect that period. So on the screen right now, we have the infographic up. It was titled, "How are Canadians with Long-Term Conditions and Disabilities Impacted by the Pandemic?" So to highlight a few of the points, we did ask about the general health status and mental health status of participants, and many reported that both their health and mental health was worse than it was prior to the start of the pandemic. And we scroll down a little bit more. Another highlight was the results showed that among participants who experienced a decrease in their monthly household income, over half reported that it was they had difficulty meeting their food and grocery needs. So we also released a daily article to go along with this that had some more employment and income focused impacts. So from that, we noticed that many participants that were employed prior to the start of the pandemic reported experiencing a temporary or permanent job loss or reduced hours since March till the time of the survey. It was about 36%. There's a few more results from it, but I won't highlight those now. We can provide you guys links if anyone's interested in looking at it in more detail. I don't want to take up too much more time. We can pop quickly to our most recent release, hot off the press today. So we released a research article and an infographic today. Looking at the infographic, we used data from the 2017 Canadian Survey on Disability, as well as the 2020 Canadian Emergency Response Benefit Administrative File. So it provides a profile of Canadian workers with disability who received CERB payments during the period from March 15th to September 26, 2020. So just quickly, some of the key findings. We found that among workers with disabilities, 35% reported that they received CERB payments. We also see that the proportion was similar by sex, but there were some differences by age, as younger workers were more likely than older workers to receive payments. And then in addition, there were some differences by severity of disability and number of disability types, as those with more severe disabilities and those with multiple disability types were more likely to receive CERB. So that brings me to the end. I hope I didn't go too much over time. I'll mention that included in our deck at the end is our contact information. So feel free to contact us with any questions. And we can send direct links for all the products we referred to for anyone that is interested. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Carly. Now we're going to turn to Deborah.
Thanks so much, Steve. And thanks, Melody, for putting on the screen my PowerPoint presentation. So as Steve said, I'm Deborah Steenstra, and I'm going to talk today about a project we did, a couple of projects we've been doing around COVID, people with disabilities, and livelihoods. Next slide, please. So first, I want to just recognize our presence and work on the unceded and treaty territories of Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and our work for reconciliation and decolonization through both our research and our partnerships. So today, what I'd like to do is to share findings from two research studies that illustrate the impacts of COVID-19 on people with disabilities. The container that I want to use to understand these is what we refer to as a livelihoods approach, and I'll start by discussing what that means. From there, I'll share some of the key impacts on diverse people with disabilities that we identified in our research and talk a bit about what COVID has meant for livelihoods. And then in conclusion, I'll ask the question, where do we go from here? Next slide, please. So as I said, these are findings from two research studies at various points. They are, and when I've got a moment, I'll hit put them in the chat button so you can get the links directly. The first is a project we were commissioned to do by Employment and Social Skills Development Canada, which was to look at the disability inclusion impacts of COVID policies on people with disabilities in Canada. We did this work throughout the fall of 2020. We looked at the impacts of government measures on Canadians with disabilities across 5 provinces, Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, New Brunswick, and British Columbia, and the federal government. We reviewed quantitative data like Statistics Canada, crowdsourced survey as well as some community surveys. We looked at the academic and community literatures. We looked at policy measures and social media. We also gathered what we call qualitative data and information through interviews and focus groups with 32 diverse people with disabilities and 12 key informants. Our research team was large, and so I'm not going to mention them all here, and included DAWN Canada, Disabled Women's Network of Canada. I'd like to thank the participants and the key informants for what they shared with us. The first site has both the full report as well as 6 fact sheets where we identify key impacts and possibilities for change. And the fact sheets are both in French and English. The second study is on livelihoods and people with disabilities. In this project, our partners include, again, DAWN Canada and CCRW, the Canadian Council for Rehabilitation and Work. We've looked at 3 pilot areas around livelihoods and disabilities related to volunteering, the arts, and pre-employment supports. And again, that is at a bit of an earlier stage, but I've included the links to the research when I hit the chat button. Next slide, please. So first, what are livelihoods and why do I think this is important? Well, livelihoods are the means by which people meet their needs in order to make a living and a life. And our livelihoods shape how we live as individuals, families, and communities, as well as our sense of well-being. They include employment, but they also include things that we don't often think about in terms of making a living and a life, which may mean market gardening, the arts, bartering, informal recycling, volunteering, and many other areas. Next slide. So a livelihood approach asks how people both survive and thrive, including during crises like the COVID pandemic. So it helps to bring into view multiple things that affect the choices that people believe they have and the options they feel like they can make. It talks about what can help and hinder the path to making a living and a life, but it also helps us understand what are factors that may work in cascading or in cumulative ways to affect the livelihoods of certain groups more intensely. A livelihoods approach looks at policies, institutions, processes, as well as unexpected situations. In our research, we use a livelihoods approach together with the concept of intersectionality. And that helps us bring attention to the lived experiences of diverse people with disabilities who are affected not just by experiences of disability, but may include disability in gender, racism, heterosexism, capitalism, and colonization. Next slide. So from these 2 research studies, we have several impacts broadly. First, and these shouldn't surprise anybody here. First, people with disabilities were largely invisible during the pandemic, despite the increased risk of getting COVID. And so they were both invisible in the experiences, but also in those general impacts. People with disabilities also were having more difficulty meeting their day-to-day needs during the pandemic and continuing in terms of food security, healthcare, and access to support services. What we also found were that existing inequalities were reinforced, and groups of people with disabilities, especially women with disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, people living in congregate living settings, Indigenous people, and racialized people with disabilities experienced disproportionately more negative impacts. Next slide. So I'd like to zero in on a couple of specific impacts and give you some experiences, some of the words of participants to share with you. So we know that during COVID, there was an intensified employment gap between people with and without disabilities. There were significant job losses, continuing reduced opportunities, the work from home policies often benefit very few people with disabilities. Young people and women with disabilities were affected especially. And so one participant said, as the pandemic progresses, my access needs increased. My job is making it difficult to use my accommodations and guilting me for needing them. There is the belief that the pandemic is over and that everybody is okay, but accessing support is still as difficult as it has been so far. Next slide. A second impact was reduced income for people with disabilities. Many, despite what, well, I guess as the today released Statistics Canada illustrates, many were not eligible for the income supplement that many Canadians received. And those who may have received it often had their disability assistance or other supports clawed back by the provinces. Other emergency funding required disability tax credit registration, which limited again the access to those benefits. As well, the continuingly high disability-related costs, in addition to the lower incomes, meant that many people had to do without, whether it was prescriptions, aids, or devices. So this participant said, I have virtually no income right now. I'm fortunate that I live with my parents and that I do have their support for certain things like shelter, food, and stuff. But I have no money right now to be able to save for school. I have no money to save for recreation or anything. It's taken away some choices in terms of not only what I can do to receive income, but what that income allows me to choose to do. I don't have those choices anymore. So this person was really talking about the choices that were constrained by the reduction of income during COVID. Next slide, please. Another impact was that there was more caregiving required as children were home or people needed more supports because their paid supports weren't able to show up. Disability-related services were closed or inaccessible. And yet less care was received. So two participants gave their comments. Accessing mental health support was harder during the pandemic. My therapy sessions were months apart and not the usual twice a month. The second person said, single mothers trying to support kids at home all the time and no family support. Like with a lot of childcare issues and problems, when all those closed down, there you were. There was a number of parents with disabilities who were marginalized more than parents without. Next slide. A final impact that I want to talk about are the reinforced experiences of vulnerability. There was more discrimination, especially for Indigenous and racialized people with disabilities, more experiences of violence for women with disabilities and those who live in congregate living settings, and generally more feelings of isolation. So one participant said, I had to stop working because me going in and out of my family home during COVID put my high-risk family at too much risk. So really tough choices people had to make. A second person said, nobody's allowed in, nobody's allowed out. And I'm sorry, but anyone who lives in a congregate care facility is in a very vulnerable position. And when no one is allowed in that place and no one out, it only makes you way more vulnerable. Next slide, please. So what does that mean in terms of what's next and beyond the pandemic? Well, in the research that we've been doing, there were some really clear directions. First of all, nothing without us is, again, the comment. Include people with disabilities, their chosen families, and support providers in decision-making, including decision-making around the pandemic. Implement systematic intersectional disability inclusive data gathering and data analysis. So don't just look at disability, but make sure we can look at Indigenous women with disabilities. Often it's really hard to do that sort of analysis. Develop and implement accessibility and inclusion standards, including in emergency management. And finally, Minister Qualtrough, get that disability income benefit created. We desperately need that. So next slide. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thanks so much, Deborah. That was great. And next up, we've got Marnie and Christiane from CCRW.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So we are Marnie Lifshit and Christiane Mann from CCRW presenting COVID-19 Building Back Better. So since the conception of the Business Solutions Department at CCRW, we have looked for Canada-specific information about the intersection of disability and business. And we've spent, a great amount of time looking for this data, and we thought, what better way to amalgamate this information and share it with business partners, industry, and stakeholders through a trends report. And so we set out to create a resource specifically for business and employers that would really push the envelope with how we engage with disability statistics. Our trends report is titled Building Inclusion in Canada, Disability in Labour Market Trends. And we aim to offer, with the backdrop of stats from Statistics Canada and other national agencies, a nuanced perspective that really is rooted in an organizational perspective that showcases lived experience. We have also positioned our stats to be engaging, interactive, and living. And when I say living in the sense that users can glean very unique insights from interacting with the various charts and data that we feature, and playing with variables in order to see data react in real time according to the variable that they're curious about. And we will showcase this in a few slides. Coming out of COVID, we're at a very critical juncture where space has been created for business to capitalize on various opportunities for growth and change. And so our trends report can help businesses really focus these efforts. Today, we'll be focusing more so on high-level recommendations, but rest assured, more content will be housed within our trends report, in which you can access through the conference materials.
Okay, so before I get started, I want to acknowledge that the topics we're going to talk about today are kind of tangled and messy, but that the themes of remote work, labor market shifts, and flexibility all cross-cut in a way that I think is meaningful for us to talk about. So these are some of the trends that emerged out of the report that Chris was referring to, and they're talking somewhat about future predictions. So there's a prediction that we're going to see some labor market shifts, job growth moving into industries like finance and insurance and IT, and those industries happen to have more capacity for remote work, and that we're going to see a contraction for sectors like retail and services, where there tends to be a higher proportion of people with disabilities employed. In this sort of labor market shift that we are predicted to see, there'll be a new demand for specific skill sets tied to that shift. And in terms of flexibility, one of our other themes, and remote work, one of our other themes, people with disability are currently more likely to be employed in sectors that require on-site work. So we talk about remote work as this complicated, imperfect mechanism to increase labor force participation, but the possibilities for remote work are linked to specific industries, which is back to that first point about job growth going into specific industries as well. So, but we are still believe that remote work and the potential return to office for employees does provide a space for rethinking workplace adjustments and flexibility. Okay, the realities of remote work. Well, I think there's multiple realities to remote work, but we've probably all heard the siren call singing the praises of remote work, even though remote work is not universally preferred by workers. So many CCRW clients have shared that remote work or flex work has the potential to enhance their quality of life. It allows them to work in a way that works better for them. The flip side to that narrative is that both StatsCan data and CCRW data show that industries with high telework possibility or potential are often industries with low levels of employment for people with disabilities. Over 60% of CCRW clients are employed in retail, accommodation, health and food services. That has some differences from the numbers of StatsCan, but those are still the leading industries according to StatsCan on employment for people with disabilities. So all these sectors, like I mentioned, are predicted to have a workforce contraction over the next decade. The second point is that businesses of more than 100 employees are twice as likely to offer the possibility of working remotely once the pandemic is over. So small and medium enterprises, SME, generally indicated that they were very unlikely to be offering remote work once the pandemic is over. This is particularly poignant for us at CCRW because the majority of our employer partners at CCRW are small and medium enterprises. So reframing remote work, what opportunities do we see in this data about predicted labor force changes and remote work possibilities? So from the perspective of employment services, there are big transitions ahead for many of our clients and for where we focus our engagement and our energies with our employer partners. So number one, we need to look at shifting some of our focus to cultivating relationship with larger employers beyond small and medium enterprises in what are more diverse for us at CCRW industries. So working with government and funders to support workforce inclusion opportunities with these new to us or diverse to us sectors. And then the second point is we need to look at working with the small and medium enterprises we currently engage with in familiar to us sectors to develop more remote work capacity. So that can look like supporting the reassessment and matching of job functions and job roles. It looks like positioning remote work as an opportunity to expand the talent pool for our workers. So that's, moving beyond geographic limitations, et cetera, and increasing the inclusion of workers with disabilities. Trend number 2, responding to labor market shifts. So following from the previous slides about capitalizing on these labor market shifts to enhance accessibility, if we see that projected job growth is in specific industries, in particular, often those with low rates of employment for people with disabilities, those industries require using specific skill sets. So data shows that employers are open to training or upskilling workers to use these skill sets. Now, much of that data is actually from large employers in sectors like information technology and finance. So these sort of link all of our themes together and all of our slides together. There are some challenges here, though. These potential job growth categories will need workers with some tech skills and are willing to do some training and capacity building, but our internal CCRW client survey showed us that only 1/3 of our clients wanted IT and computer related training to meet these skills needs. Right, navigating the big picture, essentially talking about a skills gap. So there's an opportunity here to advocate for government funding and support and collaboration for this occupational migration, which is the occupational migration is going to be the shift from one type of career to another. And it's going to take place on both a personal level and a macro level, micro and a macro level. We're also interested in looking at collaboration across the employment and education sectors to provide these skills building opportunities focused on creating tech fluency. And as an aside, and this is separate from the slide, but I figured I'd just say it, this is also a space to advocate for enhancing digital infrastructure nationally to close the rural and urban and cost connectivity gap. Better connectivity for everyone, a rising tide lifts all boats.
Okay, so for this third trend, we wanted to take the opportunity to demonstrate the interactive nature of the charts within our report. So here you can see a multi-panel chart that focuses on workers with disabilities who require accommodations. And depending on the variable that you are curious about, you can engage with the stats in targeted areas. For instance, if I was interested in youth with disabilities, I could select the age group of 15 to 24 years. And the data in the other 2 panels would react in real time to showcase stats for youth with the backdrop of the average distribution of all workers. Likewise, the same can be done for different variables. For instance, if I was interested in sex and I was looking at female workers with disabilities, and I clicked that, then the stats would also change accordingly in the 2 other panels. So looking at workplace adjustments, what we've really seen is that the pandemic has created space and opportunity for dialogue to focus on working from home, not necessarily as an adjustment, but as something that might gain more permanency over time. And so the space that's been created with these changes we've seen in the pandemic are sparking dialogue about how we can return to work. and the types of adjustment and flexibility that is possible there. As we saw in the previous graph, in the previous slide, a vast majority of workplace adjustments that are requested actually fall within no or low cost implementation. So for instance, modifying workplace duties, or enabling an employee to have flexible work hours. So the challenges to this is shifting the mindset so that accessibility is on the forefront of businesses' minds. We want to challenge the notion that we shouldn't automatically revert to wanting to go back to business as usual. Instead, there's an opportunity here to see accessibility as a strategic business benefit, and providing workplace adjustments, not just for individuals with disabilities, but for all. And so I really like the title of this slide, A Chance to Hit Reset. As mentioned, the pandemic, has really created space for additional conversation to talk about accessibility that we've seen. And, it gives employers and businesses an opportunity to evaluate their accommodation processes, either develop one or enhance what current practices they have around workplace adjustments. And as this new hybrid work from home, return to work world unfolds, there's a profound opportunity for us to make learning accessible for everybody. So to kind of sum up our presentation, there are a couple of recommendations that are coming out of our trends report, and we are featuring 3. The first being is that we challenge everyone, and not solely business, to routinely review their workplace policies. Things like evaluating jobs to see if there's a work from home potential there, to see if there's telework feasibility, to increase flexibility within jobs. These are the things that will help us move the needle towards systemic change over time. The second being is the pandemic has created space for us to identify new workplace opportunities, things like reskilling, upskilling, training, and education. And all of these work together to build a more inclusive landscape of employment for individuals with disabilities. The third and final recommendation we have is to use flexibility as a bridge to drive innovation, a bridge to have conversations about how reasonable adjustments really do improve accessibility for everybody. So taking a step back, we just wanted to say a piece about how statistics within COVID and beyond COVID, as we move into the post-pandemic world, will change, and they do tell a story. But at the end of the day, what really needs to happen is action. And so based on these recommendations, as well as the recommendations that we've seen from the other speakers in the panel today, these are the points that we really want the audience members to take home with them. So with that, we say thank you for joining us. Here's our contact information. And if you would like to get in touch, thank you so much, and we welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Christiane and Marnie. We want to turn to Gregor, and we just have 9 minutes left until we move into the next session. So Gregor, you're up.
So good morning, everybody. Very excited to be here. And thank you to the other presenters for their excellent presentations. My name is Gregor. I'm with the Angus Reid Institute, and today I'm very excited to speak with you a little bit about a recent study we did in partnership with the Rick Hansen Foundation. And I think this will be quite a nice transition from the previous presentation. Before beginning, however, it's important to acknowledge that while I'm reaching you today in a virtual format, I am physically situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish Nation. And on one final logistical note, as we're running low on time, I might be going through some of these graphs quite quickly. And so if you want to follow along or look at these later, I've popped links to the accessible versions of the report in both English and French in the chat. So without further ado, let's jump into the study and how we did it. So first, to give you a little bit of context, this is the second release in a 2-part series. The first part focused on the lead up to the last federal election. Without going into too much detail, one of the key takeaways that was that a majority of Canadians, so 55%, did not think that the question of how to best support those living with disabilities was receiving enough attention in the election campaign. So I'm happy to talk more about that in the question period if of interest, but it is also available online. The second part, the one I want to focus on today, is on how those living with disabilities perceive their experiences of joining and participating in the workforce. So first off, a little bit on how we did the study. So overall, it was just over 2,000 Canadians who participated through an online survey panel done earlier this fall. This included a nationally representative sample and an augmented sample of those known to be living with disabilities. And so for the report and the results that we're about to dive into, everything was weighted to StatScan. Thank you. Data on a host of other factors was used for this weighting, so regional populations, educational attainment, household income, gender, so on and so forth. So this gives us a fairly robust data set, which we can look at from several different angles. That being said, it is worth pointing out that there are some limitations inherent to an online survey panel. So notably, given that this study was an online questionnaire, it's unlikely that it's likely that this will contribute to an underreporting of those who may not have access to the internet or a means to read or access certain online content. So to give you a little bit more context before we dive specifically into results, just a quick overview of what we mean in this study specifically by living with disability. So for the purposes of our analysis, those living with disability have self-reported at least one condition, and they report that this condition causes them at least moderate difficulty while completing daily activities, or that their daily activities are limited at least occasionally by their disability. So on screen are the exact questions that were asked to respondents. I, of course, want to stress that this is an operational definition, and by no means are we intending this to be authoritative or some definitive idea or definition. So now let's dig into the data, and of course, mindful that we're low on time. The first graph basically summarizes the heart of the report, and the idea here is that there's a large portion of those living with disabilities in Canada that report that Canadian companies are not doing enough to hire and support them. And so, of course, echoing the other reports today and findings, these are reflective of the lived experiences of working or not during the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's break this down a little bit further. One way we did this was by severity of disability. So if we think of the questions I just showed, those with more severe disabilities were those who self-reported that their daily activities were limited more often and to a greater degree. Looking specifically at how well Canadian companies were rated as when it comes to hiring those living with disabilities, the trend suggests that companies are doing a better job, but still not great, at hiring those living with less severe disabilities. That being said, on the other end of the spectrum, only 30% of those with more severe disabilities said that Canadian companies were doing a good or great job. And of course, this is particularly interesting to note against the backdrop of an ongoing labor shortages across the country. The same trend is seen when it comes to how well companies support their employees living with disabilities. So on the more severe end of the spectrum, 31% say Canadian companies are doing a great or good job. Compare this with 46% who have a less severe disability. And so here, the trend suggests that the severity of disability has a strong impact on the lived experience of the workforce, joining and once in the workforce. Another way we can break down this data is by age and gender. We can see that, of course, echoing larger societal trends on the questions of hiring those living with disabilities, female identifying respondents reported more negative experiences overall. It is interesting to note that younger respondents living with disabilities were more likely to report negative experiences than their older peers. We didn't unfortunately have a chance to dig into why this might be, but it would be interesting to probe further to what extent this has to do with lived experiences or even changing expectations of what is appropriate or necessary in the workplace. Now, the same breakdown for how Canadian corporations are doing when it comes to supporting employees living with disabilities. Again, similar trends noted as above. with female respondents living with disabilities, again rating Canadian corporations worse than their male colleagues. Here, there is less variation by age, relatively similar numbers across the board. Overall, this suggests that there are not only barriers, or I guess when you take all this data together, this suggests that there are not only barriers to entering the workforce, but that there remain significant barriers within the workforce that are currently not being sufficiently addressed by Canadian employers. We did have a host of qualitative responses as well, but due to time constraints, I won't go into those, but they do speak to the frustration and the vulnerability and many different experiences that respondents had and frustrations with both entering and participating in the workforce. So just, I guess, one final note, and this is perhaps a bit of a departure from what I was just talking about, but when we take a step back and we include data from those who are not living with disabilities, there is a trend which suggests that there is a proximity effect. So put another way, the more exposed someone might be to someone living with disability, the more likely they are to come closer to the view of those living with disabilities. In this case, that Canadian companies are not doing a good job of providing accessible experiences to their customers and clients as they potentially could be. I'm also realizing that this is perhaps not the best graph to illustrate this, as the relationship isn't as strong, but just to highlight that this was something that was noticed playing out across multiple different questions. So going forward, I do think that this is an interesting avenue to explore. And a second approach, which I think requires more attention, and we really only brush the surface of here, and this is echoing the comments Deborah was making, is to look further at intersectionality. Unfortunately, the sample sizes in the study precluded kind of looking at this through an intersectional lens beyond, of course, age and gender. So this was a very quick overview of some of the key takeaways. There's a lot more available out there, so I encourage you to check out the reports. For those of you who are more interested in the raw data, we can also provide this to you if that is something that you would be interested in. Going forward, I'm also working on several projects in the US. So if you're interested in partnering on something to that end, I can possibly offer you some data. So please feel free to reach out. And then finally, both reports are available on the website, as well as previous studies that we have done in partnership with the Rick Hansen Foundation. Of course, happy to circulate any links, and please feel free to reach out to me if you need anything else. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregor. We've run a little bit late in terms of having opportunities for question and answer, but we'll combine that Q&A session with the beginning now of our networking session. We may have a few people joining us as well who may have come from other parallel sessions. And this is an opportunity for not only questions and answers, but also comments. And maybe I'll start with the Q&A that have already been submitted. And the first one here is, how do you balance employers who don't want to accommodate people in the actual workplace and push the person to telework or outside of the workplace versus telework as a viable option for the worker? We've had a number of our presenters kind of talk about the changes that have happened during the pandemic. One of the panelists, you can all turn on your camera if you want, all the panelists. And if you have any responses around this. What about employers' willingness to have that flexibility that's been talked about so far?
Hi, this is Christiane and Marnie speaking. I think this is a great question. And when we were reading it, we were kind of wondering,
That's a great question.
That is a great question. How do you navigate that type of situation? I think it actually boils down to culture and, whether or not an employer is truly leaning into that flexibility, or if it's just a product of what has been normalized during the pandemic. In the case where an employer is a bit more resistant and maybe not so open towards learning about workplace adjustments or how they can best accommodate their worker, I think it's more so about providing awareness, education, and maybe even adopting that business perspective, because oftentimes we find employers are resistant to change because they want to think that they're the ones who are in charge of change. And they want to think that what they're doing is truly benefiting their company. And if an employer is, providing accommodations in an individualized fashion, in a tailored approach that is flexible and trust-based, that's when the employee is really able to do their best work. And that is how the employer will also benefit as well. So it's a bit of a culture piece, a bit of an educational piece as well.
But a really good question.
I totally agree. It's a really good question. Gregor or Deborah, anything from the work you've done that might shine a light on that question?
I think it was excellently summarized already. And so I guess, echo everything that was already said.
It's Deborah. I think that, and part of this comes from my experience with my own employer. I think it's really important to have policies that go beyond sort of a general commitment to inclusion, but that are open, available to everybody, that the guidelines on which decisions are made are in line with human rights standards and are, developed both flexibly, but also consistently so that people know what to expect. And so I think it would be great, for example, if the Human Rights Commission and others, maybe CCRW, had model policies that they could share, or implementation practices that would be useful for employers to be able to share. So those are my ideas.
Just to follow up on that, do we have examples of policies that we would be really happy to ask employers to use in developing their own policies? Is there a resource out there that's already available? Does anyone know?
Hi. So at CCRW, we've been doing work on sort of policy analysis and comparative policy, specifically around workplace accommodation, disability inclusion. So we have got things that aren't ready for public consumption yet, but certainly there are lots of examples of really excellent policy out there. There's lots of examples of subpar or less excellent policy. But we are navigating and interrogating some of this work at CCRW.
All right, so we'll all kind of look forward to new stuff coming from CCRW. This next question I'm going to direct to Carly. This is from Heather, and she says, what steps are being taken by StatsCan in order to take advantage of the opportunities for intersectionality with data? That is, when data collected in an area such as agriculture has ramifications for portfolios such as those involving disabilities or Indigenous groups. Carly, what are those opportunities around intersectionality?
Well, it definitely is a little bit of a hot topic on our end. And we have been developing a disaggregated data action plan, which is encouraging specifically on our social survey side to, wherever possible, report and present results by different groups and try to be as representative as possible. We are limited in some cases due to sample size, depending on the surveys that are used and their strategies. So that's a little bit of a difficulty we face in terms of persons with disabilities. Our DSQ is kind of the gold standard for determining disability status, but it is quite lengthy. So sometimes it's not super easy to kind of slot it in on any survey, space-wise and time-wise for respondents. So we are still exploring kind of other avenues as well to try and link data and reduce response burden on people and try and make those linkages in the background to make data sets more rich and be able to get at a more granular level with the results.
Yeah, thanks, Carly. And I know that there has been an increased interest in kind of disaggregating data. Deborah, you've got something to share there.
Right. Well, I had a question and a comment for Statistics Canada and just a notion from our report. So first, one of the things that Stats Canada did was this crowdsourced data gathering during COVID, which was a novel way of getting information. Unfortunately, it's not really reliable to the same degree that other data sources are, because it isn't representative of all people, right? It's about who hears about it and participates. So you only get those who are interested views, but it's great. However, the UK has really done, the United Kingdom has done a really good job of consistent data gathering over the pandemic for people and related to people with disabilities. So, and they've been able to disaggregate it by disability, gender, and race. And so I wonder what we can learn from our colleagues in the United Kingdom. The comment I was going to make was, I was looking through Statistics Canada surveys, and I work on the university campus where it should be easy for me to get access to the disability survey. I can't actually get access to the Canadian survey on disability without going through a very lengthy research ethics process. And that means that it is much less useful data because the access is quite limited. I get the reasons for it, but I'm telling you as a user, it's a real barrier. So I have to trust that you're getting out what I need you to get out, rather than letting me figure it out and doing those sorts of things. So there's a comment for Statistics Canada. Make more of your disability data accessible to users without having to go through that lengthy ethics protocol.
Thanks for that, Deborah. You know, this is an area that has been really keen for me as well as an injured worker, to be able to understand what happens to people once they acquire that work-related disability. And there's really very little data, especially kind of thinking about the life course. So much of the research is done with very short outcome measures, 6 months after the intervention or the piece was done. And what we see is that the disabilities are not static. They change over time, and the impact change over time. And so being able to capture what's happening over that life course is so important. So this next question comes, it's a fairly lengthy one, so please bear with me as I read it out. It's from Thomas, who's a policy analyst at ESDC. He says, I found the StatsCan 2020 crowdsourced survey very useful in providing some cautious conclusions about the effects of COVID on people with disabilities. Similarly, information on industry sector effects from the presenters and forward-looking conclusions about the decline, at least for a time, of certain industries where people with disabilities are typically more represented. However, it often seems that there's a lack of data about the experience of workers with disabilities in the second half of 2021 and in the post-pandemic, post-economic recovery or downturn environment. In the second half of 2021 and perhaps the first half of 2022. To what sources or in what way can one draw conclusions about the situation of workers with disabilities in the period of recovery? So this is kind of trying to be up to date, I think, in terms of data collection, which is always a real big challenge. Where are people at with that? Carly, you want to kick it off with that?
Yeah, you definitely took one of the things I was going to say, that we are, unfortunately, it takes a while sometimes after getting the data to get it out into the world on our end. So that is tough. A lot of the other surveys that are being collected or were collected in 2020 or 2021, data won't be available until next year or the year after, depending on the processing timeline. So that's a bit tough. For disability specific, I don't have much insight. We're focusing a lot of our efforts right now on accessibility related data collection, which still, again, hasn't been fine-tuned. So kind of it's a waiting game to figure out those later pandemic impacts. And as Deborah mentioned, we had to kind of come up with some different ways to collect data that isn't as rigorous as we usually like to be. So it's a different time to try and kind of use what we can and see what's available. So yeah, it wasn't a very good answer. It's kind of a wait and see until we kind of get the data back and have a chance to produce it and publish it on the website.
You know, really kind of building on Thomas's question, you know, it seems to me from what we've heard so far is that people with disabilities, workers with disabilities have really suffered more dire consequences during the pandemic than the rest of the population. And that overall question is how can that be used by policymakers, decision makers to really have a recovery that's really inclusive of people with disabilities in the workforce? Any quick thoughts on that? I know no one's given me the magic wand yet to be able to, you know, have the power to to change things, but there's no one jumping forward. I'm going to go to another question that's in the chat. And oh geez, they keep on coming in here. Carlos is asking for a question for Stats Canada. Do you have provincial level data on the employment rates of people living with a disability? This seems to be missing from the CSD. So that's over to you again, Carly.
I'm lucky today. Yeah, we do. So we do collect labor market information on the CSD, and the sample size of the CSD does allow us to provide provincial level estimates for most of the main variables on our file. It all depends. I think we have a data table. I don't want to quote myself right now, but we may. There should be one on our website. I'll try and dig it up and provide the link that has disability rates, employment rates for persons with disabilities. I just need to confirm if it's by province or not. But if not, the information is available and we can run that and provide that information.
I want to encourage everyone to follow up with your questions or comments as well to the appropriate folks. I know Stats Can and ESDC have been interested in our input, and Carly mentioned that earlier. Deborah, got your hand.
I just wanted to know Mike Burns' comment in the chat about the Canadian Survey on Disability having a COVID question. Can Mike or Carly share with us what those questions might look like, and so that we can help you think about it? That would be really helpful.
So I know the questions have already been developed and tested as the survey is going out in the spring. I'm going to need to rely on Mike to provide me maybe some more specifics, because I was involved a little bit at the beginning of the development, but I have not seen the final questions. So I'm not super knowledgeable on that. I know it's short. They're not super detailed. We couldn't add too much given that the survey is pretty big as it is. So they kind of, I think, touch more on like overarching impacts that people may have experienced.
So I would encourage people to check out the chat. Both Mike and Susan have been inputting some additional information going forward. And we're just about out of time. Because it's all virtual, we have to make sure we're ending on time so that the next sessions can happen with the Zoom. And in fact, we're just going to be kicked out if we don't end on time. So I want to thank all of our panelists, Carly and Deborah, Christiane and Marnie and Gregor, for sharing some of the work you've been doing. I know it's just touching the tip of the iceberg here. There's lots more to share. I would encourage our participants, as I mentioned, follow up with their websites, with their information, and don't hesitate to contact them to get more information. There is contact information for most of our panelists in the conference program, along with their bio. Once again, thank you all so much, and look forward to the rest of the conference. This is just the beginning. You've set the stage so well to kind of position where we're at now. And over the next 3 or 4 days, hopefully we're going to get some more insight about what we can do with this information. Once again, thank you all so much, and we'll see you again during the conference. Take care.
Thanks, Steve, and all. Nice to see you.